Hello everybody, and welcome to this episode of, well, it's British Tank Tech Tree, or my proposed British Tank Tech Tree. I do promise it won't be just looking at an Excel spreadsheet for the whole thing. Basically, the American tanks have just been added, and, you know, they're doing okay. Presumably more of them are going to be added in future. So I've started looking at the future of other nations' tank tech trees. The British, Japanese, the French and the Italians. They're the main ones off the top of my head. I thought I'd start off with I thought I'd do some proposed tech trees, tank tech trees for these nations. Starting off with the British, I will be doing the Japanese, the French and the Italian. I've done the British because I think they'll probably be the next ones added in. It does seem to be like Russia, Germany and the main ones, followed by America, Britain and Japan. That's how they sort of do with aircraft releases as well. Now, the first thing to remember about British tanks is they didn't really do medium, heavy and light like most other nations. Well, they did light tanks, but the other two were cruisers and infantry tanks. Without getting into too much of an in-depth discussion, the infantry tanks are meant to support the infantry, heavily armoured, slow-moving, and usually armed with a 2-pounder 57mm or 75mm gun, as was its opposite number in the cruiser tank lines. Cruisers on the other hand, infantry tanks are meant to create breakthroughs. Cruisers on the other hand were meant to exploit them, so were fast, lightly armoured, and usually had the same gun as its contemporary infantry tank. But they were mechanically unreliable, which shouldn't be shown in War Thunder, thankfully, but they were lightly armoured because it had to be fast, and that made them pretty vulnerable. I don't know where the idea of cruisers even came about. I think there was a lot of naval people involved in creating tanks originally, so I don't know if it came about because of that or something, but it's a bit of a weird concept that doesn't really seem to have taken place anywhere else. It was kept throughout the war, but I think they started, once they started using American tanks and all that, it was sort of, the lines blurred a bit, and then eventually they just got rid of them. The last cruiser tank, the Centurion, was considered a main battle tank today. So yeah, they eventually got rid of the idea. I don't think they particularly used them in their intended roles for long either, or not as strictly as they might have done otherwise or envisioned originally. Basically for us it will mean the cruisers will be one lineup, infantry tanks will be another lineup, and then all the others will, the others will be the same lineup as we used to with the American, German and Russian tech trees. Now, before I waffle on too much, we'll get straight into the episode. I'll split it up into multiple episodes, just so you're aware. Before I waffle on too much, we'll get straight into looking at the tanks, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Now, as you can see, I've put for the reserve tier tank, either the Vickers Light Tank Mark 4C, or 6C, sorry, or the Medium Mark II. I'll explain this in a second, but the Vickers Light Tank Mark 6C, it was a not very good tank. It only had something like between 4 and 14mm of armour, and it was mainly armed with machine guns, but the C version, or the 6C, was armed with a 15mm Besser machine gun, or cannon, which is a bit better than what it usually had, 12.7mm machine guns. It was quite fast, about 56 kilometres on the road, or let's see if I can get that in miles an hour, 32 miles an hour, so quite fast, and probably quite good at cross country, and it was quite a small tank. Now, the Mark 6C was produced from 1934 to 1940, which makes it a bit newer than the other tank I think could be a reserve tank, the Vickers Medium Mark II, which was in production from 1925 to 1934. Now, this was better and worse. It had worse armour, only 6.25, could only manage a top speed of about 15 miles an hour. So it's inferior in speed and armour, but probably quite a bit better with armament-wise. Just secondary armament, it already beats out the Mark 6C, and the 3-pounder gun, quite a bit better. Now, I prefer the Mark 6C as a reserve tank, but I can't say that as a definite because I don't know how good the 15mm Besser machine gun is. I've heard conflicting, penetration values. at 100 metres. Some say 50, about 18mm penetration at 100 metres. I've heard others say it's nearer to 30. If it's 30, then that's manageable for a reserve tier tank, but 18, that would basically mean anything above reserve tier is basically impenetrable to its machine gun. So if it is nearer to 30mm, I think that should be the reserve tank. If it's nearer to 18, I think it should be the medium Mark II. Now that of course has its own disadvantages. I mean, it has the big gun, but it's got only 8mm armour maximum, so it'd be basically penetrable by everything, and we all know how annoying it is to have all your crew knocked out and, you know, all your modules knocked out, especially when you don't have spare parts or the fire extinguisher with which to repair any damage or put out any fires. So yeah, it'd be between those two tanks, I think would be good for a reserve tier. But both got their own strengths and weaknesses, but in the end I think the Mark 6C would be preferable if the gun was good enough. Now the next and last light tank on my list is the Mark 7 Turtharch, I can't pronounce it properly. Private venture by Vickers again. It was a pre-war tank. I actually thought it was built during the war, but it was actually a pre-war tank. 1938 to 1942 production, I think it was. But they were kind of declared obsolete, and you know, production was cut down. A lot of them were sent to, well, some were sent to Madagascar and some were sent to the Soviet Union. But then the paratroopers took an interest into it, because it was a light tank able to be taken in a glider. So it was used in D-Day, attacks on the Rhine. I think it was kind of in the end replaced by the M22 Locust, which we have in game already. Now, armour wasn't that good, 14mm, quick firing 2-pounder gun, like most British tanks, and a better machine gun, 7.92mm, not the 15mm like we was talking about earlier. There was also a howitzer version, but I haven't been able to find much information on that, so I haven't really included this. Like I said, armour isn't that good, but it can, you know, it's got a good gun. It can go quite fast, 40 miles per hour on road, 28 miles per hour off road. It's quite small. I think it would be a good addition for the British forces. And I've put it last instead of first because, you know, it did serve into 1944, while the others were all taken out of service quite quickly, like the Mark 6C and the medium Mark II. Now moving on to the cruisers, and we start off with the Cruiser Mark 1A9. As you can see, it's a bit like the T-28. I think it's the T-28. It's got those two machine gun positions at the front that were quite cramped and apparently became death traps, according to the book I'm reading. Only 125 were manufactured. They didn't do very well. It had a 2-pounder gun and a 7.7mm machine gun in the coaxial position, and obviously same armament in those two turrets at the front. Armour was 6 to 14mm, so yeah, not particularly well armoured either. It had a 24 mile per hour speed on roads and about 14 cross country. So yeah, it's not particularly, I mean, it's okay speed, but not great. The reason I put this first is because obviously low tier tank, not massively armoured, but then like I said, it's the first tank, and it's got an okay gun. It probably won't do too well. I mean, because of the armour mainly, it's got okay armament for the tier it's in, but it would be in, but yeah, the armour would let it down a bit, so you would have to be quite cautious with it, and yeah, I think it would be a good starting point. And the next tank we look at is the Cruiser Mark II A10. Now, this was a bit better. It had 8 to 30mm of armour, 2-pounder cannon, and one 7.7mm machine gun in the coaxial position. They got rid of the two turrets, which weren't particularly great. Again, it's all combat in France, and like the A9, didn't do particularly well. Did okay in Africa against the Italians, but then once the Afrika Korps arrived, didn't do that great. It was actually intended to be an infantry tank version of the A9, but it was too lightly armoured for that, which is why it was reclassified as a heavy cruiser. Again, I've put this as after the A9 because it's better than the A9. It seems like a natural evolution as they've sort of refined the design. I assume it was built a bit later because it's meant to, or about the same time, but so it fits date one. Now the next tank is the Cruiser Mark III A13. Not particularly great. It's actually got worse armour than the A10, about the same as the A9, 6 to 14 millimeters. But it was the first one with the Christie suspension, I think, which basically helped with speed. I mean, it can go 30 miles per hour compared to like the 14 or 24 on the A9. So yeah, it's quite a bit faster. I've put this after the A10 because the speed, already it's got an advantage over the A10. And yes, it has worse armour, but still got a good gun. I think it would look a bit weird if you had the Mark II and then the last and the Mark III second. It would look a bit weird. Now only a few of these were actually made, about 65 I think it says here. So yeah, it wasn't particularly great and wasn't produced much, but I think it would be needed to be put in the tech tree to give some sort of proper and logical advancement down the various marks of cruisers. Now next is the A13 Mark II, or Cruiser Mark IV. It seems to be basically a Cruiser Mark III with more armour, 6 to 30 millimeters. Now again, this was used in France, but didn't do too good. It's just, I think a few were used in Calais. I've got a book in Dunkirk, I have to try and find that. Better than some of the previous tanks, because it had the better suspension, higher speeds, but again, it just wasn't that good. But again, I think it would be needed to give them, like I said, logical progression, and it would be an advancement on the previous tanks. Now, the next tank, the A13 Mark III, or Cruiser Mark V Covenanter, was never actually used in active service overseas. You see, they produced it before they tested it properly, and there were massive problems with the design. Namely, poor engine cooling, which made it rather useless for serving in the desert, which is where most of the war was fought from 1940 to 1943, which is bad enough, but they built 1,700 of these. No, I'm probably being a bit unfair. They did use it for training, and I think some armoured divisions did use it for home defence, where the cooling was a lot less of a problem. Not being such a hot country, the UK. Better armour than the other tanks, 7 to 40 millimeters. Again, same armament, 2-pounder gun, coaxial machine gun, 7.92 millimeter, speed 30 miles an hour. I think this would be a bit better than the last tank because War Thunder doesn't take into account mechanical problems that I know of. I think the BF-109F4 lost its 20mm cannons because of that. But I digress. Generally, you're not meant to. War Thunder doesn't take into account mechanical problems, and it's got better armour than the other tanks. So again, more of a natural progression. Where have I got it? I've got it listed as a tier 2, so it wouldn't be too out of place. It would manage to handle itself well, I think, at that tier, and I think it would be a good tank to include in the British tech tree. Again, logical progression down the various marks of the cruiser tanks. Now, the next tank is the A15 Crusader, or Cruiser Mark VI. Now, this is probably the first proper cruiser tank you'll get on the lineup of British tanks, if they put it in game. The Mark I had a 2-pounder gun, 40mm of armour. Could do about 27 miles per hour on-road and about 15 off-road. But with the Mark II, it got 50mm armour. My book doesn't actually say what the minimum armour was for these two variants, or marks, unfortunately. The Mark III actually got a 6-pounder gun, 57mm. So this is where British tanks finally go up a bit in armament and armour. I've kept them separate for the tech tree, so one could be tier 2, one could be tier 3, or however it's decided. Might be a bit undergunned at tier 3, but there is a bit of a gap between till the next tanks, so should be okay. And again, natural and logical progression. You've gone from the Mark I to the 2 to the 3, all the way up to the 6, so you're not skipping any tanks, and I think this would be a good tank to have in the tech tree. Now, the next tank was sort of mentioned in passing by my books, the Cruiser Mark VII Cavalier A24, which was meant to be between the a bit of a design between the Crusader and the Cromwell. Now, it's described as a complete failure in one of my books, but doesn't give any more information. So I went online, looked at Wikipedia, other online sites. I thought it was a prototype at first because I couldn't find any pictures on it. It had 76mm of armour, 2 machine guns, a 6-pounder gun, could go 24 miles per hour on road and 14 off road, which sounds a bit similar to the Crusader, or the Mark VI. However, I found that apparently 12 of these were given to the France in 1945 and used by 14th Infantry Division. So they must have built a decent amount of these. And apparently some of these were used in training, so I don't know how many were built, but I think it would be possibly worth looking at. I've put it in just in case. Apparently the order was 500. How many were actually built in the end, I don't know. But, so, yeah, I've just put it in just in case, just so people know it's there. Now, the next 2 tanks, the Centaur A27L and the Cruiser Mark 8 Cromwell A27M, are basically the same. The Centaur had a Liberty engine and the Cromwell tank had a Meteor engine, which was better and more powerful from what I understand. Now, according to my book, it had a 7.5cm cannon and 7.92mm machine gun coaxial machine gun, and occasionally it had a 7.92mm machine gun in the hull. Armour was 8 to 76mm thick. The speed was about 38 miles per hour. So that's actually quite fast. Did wonder if that was a bit of a mistype at first. So yeah, it's the first British tank or cruiser tank that gets a decent amount of armour. These served for a long time. From what I understand, they served up to 1950, according to my book. Some of the later models did get 102mm of armour, but trying to keep the the amount that's on there, like different variants, down a little bit, just keeping it basic. There's actually a silhouette thing on outline online, and it does look like it's a bit smaller than the Sherman, so like silhouette wise, so that should hopefully help in War Thunder during actual games, maybe make it better for ambushes or while trying to escape your enemy. Yeah, I think this would be a good tank to have in the game. I've put both variants, so maybe again more natural progression, so you can, and to fill it out a little bit without introducing all the different marks and variants. So yeah, I think both of these vehicles would be good for the game. The Cromwell in particular is iconic, and the Centaur's basically the same, so it helps pad out the tech tree a little bit, while keeping and it adds another good tank. So yeah, I think they should both be added if possible. Now, at first I thought the next tank was a tank destroyer, but it's the Cruiser Tank Challenger, or A30. Also seen it called the Mark 8, which is odd because that's what the Cromwell is. Basically, this was an attempt to get a 17-pounder gun into a tank turret. This is what they came up with, this big bulky design. Armour was from 20 to 102mm in thickness. Wasn't particularly successful because but it wasn't ready in time to be waterproofed for Normandy landings, so it had to be brought over by boats and actually dropped off at a harbour, or on the Albury harbours, I assume. And by the time it was in Europe, they'd already made the Sherman Firefly, so there wasn't really a need for it, since that was generally superior. Some were used to provide extra fire support to the Cromwells, which only had the 75mm gun. Had a speed of 32 miles an hour. I think this should be added because, well, it is a good tank. It's got a big gun, and the armour is okay. I think it would be good for Britain to have this, because it is like their first homegrown 17-pounder tank. We got the Sherman Firefly, but it's based on an American design. So I would prefer both being in, but really, I think it would be... I've put it as tier 4 because that's where the 17-pounder guns would really start coming in, needing to be used. Again, it could be swapped around a bit. And I think it would be a good upgrade from the Cromwell, while being, not as good as the Comet. So yeah, I think both the Firefly and the Challenger should be added in if possible. Now, the next tank I had to rely on online information a little bit, because I don't really have any information on this tank. It's the Cruiser Comet 1 A34. it was basically one of the last cruisers, or second to last cruiser. It was armed with a 77mm gun, which is based on the 17-pounder, and had the two 7.92mm machine guns. Could do 32 miles per hour, and it had up to 102mm of armour. Doesn't say what minimum is, unfortunately. And this was like the British tank from in use from 1944 to 58. From what I understand, there was it wasn't used massively during World War II because of its late arrival, like with the Pershing and other tanks. I don't know how much combat it actually saw. It was used in Korea, but again, there wasn't particularly many tanks there for it to attack and destroy. Now, this is a good tank because, again, thick armour, but it's basically one of the last tanks introduced into service in the war. Got good speed, like I said, good gun, good armour, and I think again it would be a natural upgrade from the Challenger, a more capable tank. So, and is a bit kind of iconic of late post-war tanks, or late war tanks, I suppose. So yeah, it would be good to have in the game, I think. Now, the next tank I did have some information on, the Centurion main battle tank. This is actually the last cruiser tank Britain made, but it sort of, became a main battle tank because it was able to be upgraded and it had decent armour. Just finding the armour. 6 inches of armour, and it started off with a 17-pounder gun. As you can see in the tech tree. It was later on upgraded to a 20-pounder gun. It also, as a secondary armament, had a 20mm cannon or 30 caliber Browning machine gun. Now, I've also got the 105mm listed. I've actually got written down outside cut-off date, but I've sort of included it there because we don't know what the cut-off date for the tanks is. As far as I don't know if it's the same as the planes. As far as I know, it's meant to be, but there could be a little bit of leeway with that, so I've included it just in case. I mean, one of my books actually describes this. I'm quoting, "To many people, the Centurion has been the most successful tank design in the history of armoured warfare." And you can kind of see why, because it started off with a 17-pounder gun, like most British tanks or at the end of the war, but then it was upgraded to a 20-pounder gun and then to a 105mm gun, which is still okay today. I think the original Abrams used the exact same gun, and that was in like the 1980s, so it's not a bad gun, and it's so long-lived. I think Sweden only got rid of theirs in the 90s. I think South Africa, they have a tank called the Oliphant, which I believe is basically an upgraded Centurion. I think they upgraded them only in the 2000s, and as far as I'm aware, they still use them, possibly. I think Israel used armoured personnel carrier and other type of unarmed variants in the 2006 war with Lebanon. There's just so many different variants of them, and they are still used today. I think Britain was still using them in the 1991 Gulf War. I'm looking online. One was used in a nuclear bomb test. Survived the nuclear bomb. The crew would have all been killed apparently, and was then sent to Vietnam and fought in Vietnam. This was a tank that survived an atomic bomb from, I think, 500 metres away or something. The only thing that was wrong with it was that it ran out of fuel, and I think it may have fallen on its side. Can't quite remember. Like I said, it was probably would have killed the entire crew, and I think maybe some of the armour was blown off, and I'm assuming it suffered other damage. But the tank itself was drivable and all that. I think they actually drove it away from the test site. So I think this definitely needs to be added in, whether it's in the 17-pounder, 20-pounder or 105mm variants. I would prefer all of them, well, all of them with inside the cut-off date, because I think this would be a good match for the Russian and German and American high-tier tanks, and it would, is a bit of an icon for the post-war British tanks. I know I said that about the Comet, but, this is more of an icon, and it would definitely be a mistake to not have it in the game. I'll probably leave the episode there because, we've only done the cruisers and the light tanks, and it's already coming up to like half hour or something. Like I said, I'm going to split this into different segments. I'll be doing the infantry tanks and maybe the Commonwealth and other vehicles, depending on how much time I have, or I may split them into different episodes. Like I said, this is just a basic skeletal framework of what I think should be the British tech tree. There are variants, lots of sub-variants of different tanks. None I didn't include either because I thought they wouldn't add much to a basic tech tree, you know, they're something to add in later on, or because I couldn't find information. The Turtratch, I still can't pronounce it, howitzer, for example, I couldn't find any pictures of that, so I didn't really include it. There was that one tank, I think it was the Cavalier, I couldn't find any pictures of, but I included it because there was enough information to say it was produced and, you know, it was used. But anyway, thank you for watching the video. Please leave a like if you like the video. Leave feedback. I could always do feedback. If you do spot any mistakes, I don't think I've made any, but yeah, and okay, different books do disagree with each other, so it may not just be a mistake, it may be disagreements between books, but don't hesitate to, you know, put any of your own information, or if I've missed out information, don't hesitate to put, leave it in the comments, and I'll try and add it in as a annotation. Subscribe if you like these sorts of videos. I haven't done one of these in ages, so I've had a bit of fun doing it, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed them. I'll see you next time.